A Przewalski's horse clone was born last year from cells cryopreserved at San Diego Frozen Zoo. His name is Kurt. This was not a scientific experiment. Cloning has become somewhat banal already. This was a conservation effort. The Przewalski's horses are an endangered species thought for a long time to be the last truly wild horses. They became extinct in the wild in the 1960s but survived thanks to individuals that were brought in captivity in the beginning of the 20th century. And although there are about 3,000 wild horses now alive, they are all descendants of only 13 individuals, which means a tiny genetic pool. Like many other species in this situation, despite being survivors of a genetic bottleneck, this low genetic diversity threatens them. They have low ability to cope with disease and environmental change, so they are still at risk to become extinct. Kurt's name comes from Kurt Penirske, the man who had the idea to create the frozen zoo. It began in 1972 as a repository for skin cell samples, a frozen archive for rare species. At the time, genetic technology was in its infancy, but there was a sense that one day scientific advances might use these cells, better safe than sorry sort of thinking. As Carrie Friese points out in her wonderful book Cloning Wildlife, there was also a sense that this suspended genomic information still contributes to the entire genetic population, that the cells are proto-individuals that occupy less space than the living animals required to maintain a species. In zoos, space was very precious, and horses are big. The entire frozen zoo occupies basically only one room, a gigantic menagerie in 4 deep freeze tanks. 50 years after the creation of the frozen zoo, Kurt was cloned because he carries rare genes. There are good chances that Kurt will grow and breed. He will have a role in the genetic rescue of his species. But Kurt is still related to most other Przewalski's horses in existence. He descends from the same captive ancestors as all the other individuals in the species. Yet his genes are rare, which means that he comes from an underrepresented genetic line. It means that in the 100 years of the captive history of this species, the longest history of captive breeding in the world, his ancestors did not breed enough. Contingencies, practices, and ideas made it so that Kurt's lineage was marginalized by zoo people and genetic information was lost as generations of captive horses went on. So in a way, the cloning is not a recalibration of the species, but a reparation of past mistakes, recovering what predecessors have neglected. Kurt's story reveals the losses occurred over a century-long journey of saving the Przewalski's horse. The story of the clone and the contemporary discussions around this technology of the extinction are fascinating, and Carrie Friese's book is great on that. Here I will focus on the equally fascinating question of why did Kurt's genes become rare? What are the practices that thinned this genetic line in zoos? And what ideas have shaped the genealogies, the lives and bodies of these animals? And what were the changes in the 1970s and 80s that shifted the perspective and suddenly created genetic value out of previously neglected animals? To answer this, we must jump back to the 1980s and look at Kuporovich, Kurt's clone father, or original twin, or whatever we want to call the horse whose rare genes were resurrected. He was born in 1975 in London. He was also called 615, as he was the 615th Przewalski's horse to be listed in the stud book. To understand how he came to be rare, let's take another jump back 75 years before he was born. In the beginning of the 20th century, Przewalski's horses had just been discovered as a distinct species. They were already rare by that time. Zoos and private animal collectors wanted to have them, but they were expensive and hard to come by. About 50 foals were captured in Mongolia by animal traders and spread around the world. But after the traumas of violent capture and transport, in the new captive conditions, only 12 survived and reproduced. One pair was bought by Julius Kuhn, the director of the Agricultural Institute in Halle, Germany. He was interested in the hybridization of hoofed animals, in fashion among breeders and zoologists at the time, seeking to test the boundaries of crossbreeding and heritability of traits. Together with the pure-blood Przewalski's horses came a domestic pony mare, foster mother to the young foals. The male wild-caught foal grew up to become a stallion, and he had a hybrid son called Theodor with his foster mother, the domestic mare. When his father died, Theodor became the only stallion living in Halle. He bred with his pure-blood half-sisters, and from his 9 children, only 2 survived and reproduced, Ali and Minka. They were technically children of a hybrid, also called three-quarter blooded animals, but they somehow still counted as Przewalski horses. Ali and Minka were bought in the 1920s by František Bilek, a hypologist at the Czech University of Life Sciences in Prague. Later, they were transferred to Prague Zoo. Impure as they were, they became the founders of the Prague line of Przewalski's horses. When Ali died, another stallion was imported from across the ocean from Washington. This stallion, Horimir, was a descendant of a wild-caught mare at Cincinnati Zoo, who was strongly supposed to be a hybrid herself. Horimir, Ali and Minka, all Przewalski's horses with recognized or presumed domestic blood, were the ancestors of Kuporovich, the clone father. Many Przewalski's horses were lost during World War II. Only 31 survived, the ones from Prague Zoo and the breeding herd from Munich's zoo Hellerbrunn. They were all descendants of the initial imports at the beginning of the century. As no other wild horses were caught after 1902, in fact only one was caught in 1947, a mare. So there were mostly no horses to supply the population with fresh blood, as it happened with other captive species at the time. The Munich Hellerbrunn Zoo, led by the director Heinz Heck, was more successful than Prague in terms of numbers. They bought horses from overseas, facilitated by the monopolies held by German animal traders. The most famous animal trader, Karl Hagenbeck, was actually Heinz Heck's father-in-law. They had horses from Askania Nova in Ukraine, from Sydney, from Washington, from London. Heinz Heck was an interesting character. Coming from a family steeped in zoology, his father was the director of Berlin Zoo. He was also a member of the Nazi Party. He was interested in heredity, in phenotypical trait inheritance, and he was also a preservationist. But he would become marginalized by the other zoo breeders because he conducted borderline experiments. He was trying to breed back primeval animals. The extinct cattle, aurochs, and the species of extinct horses, tarpans. He was also marginalized because of his exaggerated concern with selecting for aesthetic traits. Nonetheless, Heinz Heck had horses to choose from at Hellerbrunn, and after 1950 he started to eliminate descendants of the Prague line. He killed off about 6 or 7 horses that he had bred before. The 2 lines, Prague and Munich, were kept separate from then on, and without exchange, genetic diversity shrunk. But this phenotypical approach was not only Heck's creed. Some of the other breeders embraced it too. They were all trying to purge the domestic genes by selecting against the animals with certain traits, like white stars on the forehead or foxy reddish color in the fur. They were trying to select against horses that lacked black pigment in the mane and in the legs. They thought that these are signs of domestic introgression. Up until today, the horses descended from the Munich line are recognizable by their dark stockings. In this respect, Kurt is a bit different. as a true descendant of the old Prague line. He lacks this black pigment in the legs and he doesn't have this appearance of stockings. Luckily, some zoo people believe that the original wild population of Przewalski horses hybridized naturally with domestic horses anyway. So they thought there was no such thing as purity, and the one more event of introgression that had happened in Halle at the beginning of the century made actually no difference. So they continued to breed the Prague line. Among them was the London Zoological Society's Whipsnade Zoo, who bought a breeding pair from Prague, Divoch and Pusina, in 1954. They were Kuporovich's maternal grandparents. Later, Vesemir, Kuporovich's father, came to the UK from Prague in 1970, bought by the newly founded very progressive zoo Marwell. Both Marwell and Whipsnade sold old Prague line horses in 1978 to another progressive new zoo founded in the United States, Minnesota. Minnesota was at the time the only one in North America who had Prague line horses. All the others had pure Munich stock, imported in the US in the 50s. Kuporovich was brought to Minnesota 3 years old in 1978 to be the breeding stallion of a herd. He had two sons, JT, maybe from John Travolta, I don't know, and Adolf. But Adolf and JT had no offspring. Kuporovich was not a stallion for long. To avoid future inbreeding, he was replaced soon with a new import from New York, Kentay, and Kuporovich was placed in a group of bachelors. Also, among the breeders, probably alarmed by Minnesota's bold step, a policy was set in place to prohibit breeding with horses from Prague domestic ancestry. But in mid-70s, the game changed completely. Studies spurred by statbook analysis and the rise of computers that enabled statistic analysis showed that even if the Przewalski horses were upheld as an example of a captive self-sustaining population, a close look at records proved serious cause for concern. Fertility and longevity were decreasing, and illnesses apparently due to inbreeding started to appear. All over the place, captive breeding was surfacing as in need of reform. The late 70s and 80s were also high time for genetic studies that will have a heavy influence on the management of horses. The studies concluded that there was a rapid and steady loss of genes from the beginning of the captive population. The cause for problems were small population sizes kept at each zoo, selection, and overemployment of certain stallions for breeding. The studies calculated gene survival, talked about a loss of founder genes, and contended that it is the gene pool itself which must be preserved through subsequent generations. This preservation of gene pool, they thought, was achievable, and geneticists set off to find those individuals that were underrepresented and then needed to breed. Analysis produced by John Ballou, Charles Geyer, and Oliver Ryder, who is the headmaster of cloning herd, showed that Kuporovich was the carrier of valuable genetic material, even though, they mentioned, he also carries genes of the domestic mare founder. He was a genetically important individual in the North American population, meaning highly likely to have unique copies of founder genes, present in no other individual in the pedigree. They recommended that Kuporovich be put together with a few mares to breed again. He was then 13 years old, a middle-aged horse. He did have a few more offspring, but his genes remained underrepresented in the US population. Interestingly, the old phenotypic concerns did not go away in the late 80s and 90s, and in fact, they are still there today. Selecting to keep the looks of the horses uniform was still high on the agenda of meetings. In 1989, at the Global Master Plan meeting held at San Diego, Oliver Ryder concluded, "I think we agreed we are not going to act in ways that cause loss of founder alleles. Alleles are part of genes, but still we can apply some selection to stabilize phenotype." This is a story of an almost loss, a story of 1 century of grappling with loss and averting extinction. I try to show you how different ways to understand an animal and the species came together in a history of 100 years. What the Przewalski's horse meant and how people interacted with them differed and changed over time. Some accepted hybridization as a natural way of things, others not. Some looked at the external features of a horse, others looked at genealogical charts and pedigrees, yet others looked inside the horse at their genes. Even if the Przewalski's horse is considered a successful conservation story today, tiny genetic diversity still causes lots of concern. 1/3 of the population nowadays lives free in Mongolia. They were reintroduced since 1992. But even here, their fate is tied to the domestic horses. Hybridization in the wild is seen as a major threat. Cloning Kurt is also bound to a domestic horse. Kurt's surrogate mother is a domestic mare. It seems that the history of recovering an almost lost lineage has come full circle, symbolically and materially. Wild and domestic horses are bound together.